Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Callum MacDonald. Hello. And here's Jeff Aberdeen, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Alex Salmond. Hello, Jeff.
Good morning.
And Andy McKeever was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
Lovely to have you with us. Thank you for finding us on the podcast. Thank you for listening. If this is your first time here, then make sure you subscribe on whatever app you're listening, and then you'll get our episodes every single week. Before we get to today's issues and discussions, shall we read out Richard's message? He wins WhatsApp of the week for this. Andy is right. Federalism, where each nation and region of the UK each has its own parliament with significant and constitutionally entrenched powers, is a viable and sustainable answer to the constitutional question. He says the Scottish Parliament needs protection from any attempts to abolish it that may come about with the rise of populism. Federalism, underpinned by a written constitution, will safeguard its future. How can this prospect become a reality? Considering Labour's general resistance to small r reform and its small c conservative approach in the political reform space, such as its backtracking on House of Lords reform. Andy, is there an opportunity for Anas Sarwar to be bold here, asks Richard.
Well done, Richard, firstly. Excellent message.
2 weeks in a row.
YouTube viewers will watch Jeff rolling his eyes, shaking his head. But Richard's on it. Richard knows the score.
He knows.
Unfortunately, though, no. I think it's extremely unlikely that this is ever going to happen for a couple of reasons. I think unionists generally still have failed to adapt to what devolution actually means for them. I think unionists have failed to understand that they have rigged devolution against themselves. Devolution's far too easy for the SNP, the way that it's been set up, because as unionists don't like me saying, but as I've said before, you can't really escape what's going on in Westminster. You can't outrun your Westminster party, and Labour is obviously seeing that right now. I ultimately don't think that the intellectual capacity exists within unionism to understand how badly it's going for them and how to fix it. And I also don't think that the emotional capacity exists within unionism to understand that actually what you need to do is you need to give the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government more power, not less. Because at the moment, as has been the case throughout the entire time they've been in government, the SNP have very easily been able to blame Westminster for the things that have gone wrong and take the credit for the things that have gone well, because that's how devolution is set up. If there was a more federal structure where you, for example, raised the money that you spent and where you were more responsible and more identifiably responsible for decision-making, I think things would be different. And I think there would also be the ability to have other different political parties rather than ones that were just branches of Westminster, which is ultimately where this has all gone wrong for unionists. So, Richard, it would be a great idea. I think it would be very beneficial for Scotland and indeed for the UK, but I have to be really negative about the chances of it actually happening.
You totally mischaracterise my eye rolling. I would be very supportive of full federalism and full fiscal autonomy for Scotland. Obviously I would, because I believe in Scottish independence, but if that happens, and if it did happen, Scotland become fully fledged independent nation not too far in the distant future beyond that. There's no doubt, because if you can prove that the country can raise its own money and spend its own money, then the natural extension is full sovereignty thereafter, in my opinion. It might take a bit of time, but you'll get there. But I actually think Andy's analysis is sound. We need to see a Scottish government, in my opinion, that takes more responsibility. And some of the decisions it might not be able to make that it's making just now in policy, because it would know that it has to balance the books through a completely different fiscal and financial envelope. And that's something that I think would be very good for Scottish politics and better for our society, in all honesty. Greater financial fiscal responsibility would lead to better political outcomes ultimately, because tough choices would have to be made, but ultimately that would stop this point about either blaming Westminster or having a situation where you say that, we're in such a tight financial envelope, this is all we can do. You're saying, well, actually, no, it's to govern is to choose, and that's full economic policy as well as public policy choices.
Jeff may be right. Federalism may
Jeff
lead
is
to independence. Right. That is entirely possible that is where it could be. I don't think it would. I think it would potentially be the opposite. But it might lead. But that's okay if it does lead to that. That's okay as long as people are able to make a choice based on that, and as long as we're able to identify whether or not the people that we have running the country are able to run, firstly, a devolved country, then a federal one, and an independent one. It's possible it could lead to that. I don't think so, but I think it's possible.
So Andy, just on this, just to be clear, are we talking about the same thing? Full federalism is essentially everything would be reserved to the Scottish Parliament, apart from essentially foreign affairs and embassies, really, essentially
pretty
international relations.
I would flip the system on its head, whereby at the moment Westminster reserves power and gives it to Holyrood. I'd flip that on its head, in that Scotland would effectively be sovereign and would give powers back to Westminster over things it wanted pulled. It's not an unusual system. I mean, it's more similar to what happens in Canada, for instance, in Australia. That's the sort of system that I would want, and I don't think it would lead to independence. But I'm happy to accept that it might, and I don't mind that, because people would be able to then make a choice. And in the meantime, we should be able to have a better governed country, which actually gets more done because it has more levers to do it.
Yeah, and I suppose the point there is that it would only lead to independence if federalism was judged to be a success, and therefore there's more onus on politicians to make it work, particularly from the SNP, obviously.
Do you think the federalism suggestion that you guys are making just now is something that you can sell to the public? Do you think the public look at the Scottish Parliament and think, do you know what is needed here is what you are suggesting?
I don't think they do at the moment. No. I think it would need a sell. I mean, I think the reality is, and we polled this, a year ago or so for our devolution event, there used to be 10% of the public who want the Scottish Parliament scrapped. It's now 20% who want the Scottish Parliament scrapped. So there are more people who would want the Scottish Parliament scrapped, I suspect, than would go for something more federal. People don't know what federalism is. They would, it would need to be a bit of a campaign of what would make this better here. But I think you would probably start from the point which a lot of the public, I think, does accept, which is that devolution is underperforming and has underperformed for quite some time, and that something needs to happen. I just don't think there's any, that there's no requirement by any of the political parties, as far as they're concerned, though, to have that discussion. Why would the SNP have that discussion? Everything's fine for them. Even if somebody like Anas Sarwar thought to himself, actually, this is kind of what we need to do, at the end of the day, the first phone call is to Keir Starmer, right? And what's Starmer going to say? I'm kind of busy, I've got Ukraine, there's this Middle East thing going on. I've got Nigel Farage knocking on the door. I could do without another big constitutional issue. So, give me don't call me, I'll call you. That's the answer, right?
I know.
I just don't see the mechanism for how this actually gets anywhere unless there's some sort of intervention in the system by a
Reform
new
UK
organisation. Well, the interesting thing about that, though, is that is actually not them, obviously, but that is the model. If you want something done in Scotland to really break the problems in the system and break the logjam, you need some sort of you need an intervention, you need an insurgency of some sort, not a reform-style one, but something more in the middle.
I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I don't agree with Andy. He said something quite lazy, in my opinion, in terms of his analysis when he goes, everything's fine with the SNP. I just think that is complacency in the extreme. I mean, and I certainly hope that the SNP don't think like that, because their vote is down considerably on 2021. They are winning right now in the polls, if they are to be believed, because of the rise of reform, splitting the unionist vote. Nothing else is doing that. Let's be clear, in terms of pure data. And so we've all talked about the steadying of ship of the SNP, but there needs to be a hell of a lot more. And so my point would be that there has to be a proposition on the constitution from the SNP. We've said that before. We'll wait and see what the bones of that is in the run-up to the election. But to suggest that everything's fine and rosy with the SNP, just don't accept that analysis.
But don't you think that the programme for government told that story? I mean, you look at the programme for government, and I think the manifesto will be similar. That's a programme for government of a party which is very comfortable with where it is and doesn't feel the need to do anything radical or rock the boat because it has no competition, has nobody knocking on the door.
Yeah, but I agree with that. But your point is everything's fine. I don't think that's fine at all. I've said before, it needs to be better.
I'm
strive for much better than okay.
Talking through their voice, I think that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
I think they're saying everything's fine.
Yeah.
And that is why Richard wins WhatsApp of the Week. It's a thought provoker. If you'd like to get in touch, you can do 0333 404 6507. Thank you for that, Richard. Coming up on the podcast today, then, the EU-UK reset deal and what it means for Scotland. And we'll have a look at the Hamilton by-election as well, which is coming up in just a couple of weeks on the 5th of June. You can watch all of this on YouTube. Search for Holyrood Sources, where you get full episodes. You can find us on X for clips as well, and on TikTok. And subscribe to our mailing list at holyroodsources.com. Just one announcement for you then this week. On the 25th of June, we are coming to Edinburgh for our next Holyrood Sources live recording. We're beginning our build-up to the Scottish Parliament election in 2026 with the Battle for Bute House, supported by Diageo and hosted at Johnny Walker, Princess Street. We'll be hearing from both John Swinney and Anas Sarwar in the evening of the 25th of June, live. Plus, you can be there to ask them questions, to take part in the podcast. It is most likely that one of these two men will be voted in as the First Minister of Scotland after the election in 2026. So, to come and join us, go to holyroodsources.com/live, get your ticket, come on down, and we will see you in Edinburgh on the 25th of June. We're very much looking forward to that. Right, let's get into some of the issues and subjects of the day. First of all, I want to start with this from Murdo, who was listening to our interview with Energy Minister Michael Shanks. That was last week's episode. He said it was rigorous and robust. It's a testament to the podcast format that you could take the time to really get to the marrow of things, is what Murdo says. He says, I saw Michael Shanks on debate night with Jeff, and I couldn't get a measure of the man's grasp of things, but the podcast helped me understand him much better. I'm really encouraged by him working with Kate Forbes and Gillian Martin. I'm starting to get a better understanding of GB Energy as well. As someone involved in community energy projects in Lewis, as well as working in the oil and gas sector in Aberdeen, there was just so many touch points for me. While I see strength in the approach to clean energy, I still feel there is a fundamental misunderstanding about the oil and gas industry. Investor confidence is shot. This is perhaps a good time then to mention the front pages of today's Press and Journal and The Scotsman. Over 2,500 energy workers, business leaders, supply chain employees and community representatives have backed an immediate end to the North Sea windfall tax. They warn that the northeast of Scotland is at grave risk of losing world-leading skills. The letter comes, of course, after Harbour Energy announced 250 job losses. We'll get thoughts from Jeff and Andy in just a sec, but first of all, a reminder of what the Energy Minister, Michael Shanks, told this podcast last week when we asked if he backed an immediate end to the Energy Profits Levy.
It is personal to everybody in the sense that we all know someone in Scotland who works in the oil and gas industry. I've got family and friends who work offshore, and so it is important, and I recognise that. I think we have recognised the issue around the EPL. James Murray was in Aberdeen engaging with the sector as well. We heard a lot of views, which is why the allowances were changed in the budget. That was a direct response to what we heard from industry, and industry welcomed that change. The EPL will fall in 2030, and I think the consultation's still open, or it's about to close on the future of that, because we want to give a sort of sustainable plan for what the future of taxation is in the North Sea. But understandably, I hope you will say I'm not going to comment on wider tax policy in the short term. I do think there's a wider sort of point about this, and it's why I said to the Harbour Energy announcement, we're going to get a plan in place, because look, any job losses in any part of the economy are devastating for those people, for their families, for the community they come from. And, I always recognise those on a really personal level, the impact that those have. But there is a need for us to sort of recognise this isn't something that just suddenly started happening in July last year with the election of a Labour government. A third of the oil and gas workforce have lost their jobs in the past 10 years, more than 70,000 people. The North Sea has been in transition for a long time, and governments have failed to grasp the fact that that means you have to plan for the future.
That's Michael Shanks. Jeff, talk to us then about these 2,500 people who have signed this letter today. Some might hear this and think this is rich oil and gas companies who are being taxed, complaining about being taxed. What is their issue? What are they saying?
Well, it's all the greatest hits, really. I mean, it's an amazing amount of people to have signed the letter. I can tell you that the local chamber informed me that when they've done an open letter in the past, the most amount of signatures they've had is 1,000, and they've actually had 2,500, which just tells you the strength of feeling across the region. And I think, as you pointed out in your opening there, this isn't just oil and gas workers. This is all industry. So this is from different business sectors across the region. They recognise the indirect impact on them, but also charities, third sector organisations, Aberdeen Cyrenians, a homeless charity, Cash for Kids charities. They all recognise the impact of this policy on the on particularly in the region, but the entire sector across, and there's impact across the Scotland and the UK, because energy workers reliant on oil and gas are not just in the northeast but concentrated here. A couple of points really, and the letter itself, I'd refer it to everyone. It just makes the point that why are we inhibiting our own domestic oil and gas supply when we are just relying ever more on carbon-heavy imports from overseas. We don't get the economic benefit, we don't get the jobs benefit. But pointing out, as we did last week with the Energy Minister, that even the Climate Change Committee says that we're going to need significant oil and gas until 2050. So let's produce as much as we can from our own domestic supply. But one point I wanted to make is, I was watching the Chancellor's business questions yesterday, and she kind of made the point that she said that this reflects the fact that energy companies have enjoyed huge profits since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and it's right, when people's bills have gone up, that we ask the energy companies making those profits to contribute a little bit more. Well, the windfall has not existed in some 2 years, and prices have well gone below that of the Ukraine-Russia crisis when it initially that tragedy started. But just a couple of points I just don't understand. So firstly, her old employers, Lloyds Banking Group, made 6.3 billion profit in 2024. That is a grand total of 6.3 billion more than Harbour Energy, who have just lost all these jobs. Are we going to start taxing Lloyds Banking Group at 78%? I suggest we probably aren't. And a nice little example, I believe you've used this example before, Callum, if I heard you correctly in discussing with Ed Miliband, but Greggs make nearly £300 million more than Harbour Energy in 2024, and that's selling sausage rolls. That's going some. So the whole thing is absurd. It is an unfair tax. It should come off. We need to motivate investment in the sector, as Murdo has said in his contribution to the programme. And let's take a pragmatic approach to this, and ultimately sustaining that supply chain, that world-class supply chain, as at such time renewables is available at scale.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I'm more a steak bacon, a yum guy, if I'm being honest.
Sausage rolls are awesome,
I mean,
Greggs. Honestly, they're a different class. You should try a sausage roll, bud. Honestly.
I have. Listen, I've been doing this a long time. I'm not against the sausage rolls. I'm just saying, if I have my choice, and if they're warm enough, if they're hot enough in there, I'll go steak bacon and maybe a yum to top things off.
A steak
However,
bacon,
I do feel that
yum.
we may be in some danger of going off topic here.
Can I just throw in a pink jammy as well? A cheeky pink jammy. They're amazing.
Right. Greggs, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, we're here for you. Andy,
This is now territory where Callum's thinking I might edit this because this is rank. I thought our discussion, just to get back to Murdo's point, I actually really enjoyed our discussion with Michael Shanks last week. I thought he was excellent. He was completely unafraid of any topic. He wouldn't have given answers that everybody wanted to everything, but I thought he dealt with it really well, and I was impressed with him actually. I did mention to him, though, what I called the sniff test at the time, and I think ultimately that's the problem that we face here. If I broaden this out from oil and gas to a bit wider into energy, we have a growing planet, we have a growing world, we need more energy, and we know that at the moment we don't have the scale of renewables or the scale of storage for that to fill the gap, so we need to use fossil fuels. And why are we even getting ourselves into a system and a situation where we risk not being able to use our own and having to import somebody else's, which A, costs us money and B, costs us carbon at the same time because we're importing it. It doesn't make sense. As I said last week, it doesn't pass the sniff test. And therefore, you have to look at the tax regime and say, is that helping or hindering? And frankly, I think there's only one answer here. I would, as somebody who is deeply committed to our energy transition, and thinks it's necessary and could be very economically successful as well. Ultimately, you've got to say, look, stop taxing these people in this punitive way, and instead, let's work with those who are making profit from fossil fuels to make sure that certain amounts of that profit are filtered back in, as they would be anyway, to renewable development, to community benefit work, and actually, rather than taking it into Treasury coffers, let's actually make sure that the profits are spent in the places we need to spend them to get the transition moving faster and faster and faster. I think that's something that everybody could fairly easily come together on.
Hear, hear.
Let's go on. We want to discuss the UK-EU reset deal next. Some sections of Scotland's fishing industry have accused Sir Keir Starmer's government of capitulating to the EU over this deal on access to UK waters. Labour ministers agreed a 12-year deal which extends existing access for EU boats in exchange for reduced checks and restrictions on food exports. The agreement's been described as disastrous by the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes said it was a great betrayal of our fishing fleet. But fish farming body Salmon Scotland welcomed the deal, saying it slashes red tape, which will allow Scottish products and people easier access to the EU. In 2023, the UK exported £1.2 billion worth of fish to the EU, which is around 70% of all fish exports. So on this, Andy, I think with EU-UK relations at the centre of this, fisheries policy has got two key arrangements. So it's access to each other's waters and then quota shares, i.e. how the total allowable catch of fish is actually then shared out. Does Scotland win or lose in these areas as part of this reset, or is the picture a little bit more complex than a binary win and loss?
I think it's more complex as a whole than that. I think what is always the case is that the Scottish fishing industry, in isolation, always loses from negotiations with the EU, and it always has. That's unfortunately because of the fact that economically there are bigger issues at play as far as the government is concerned. As far as this Labour government is concerned, there are bigger issues at play. As far as previous Conservative governments are concerned, there are bigger issues at play, and there are bigger trade wins. And the reality of it, I don't particularly like it, and I'm sure a lot of listeners won't like it either, but the harsh reality of it is that economically, Scottish fishing industry is worth sacrificing. And they do. That's what they do. But this gets back, I think, to what I said earlier on about the setup. This is just too easy for Labour to be pilloried on and for the SNP to score a political victory. I mean, another disaster for Anas Sarwar who gets thrown under the bus by something that Labour does. Why don't we have a situation in the sort of federal structure that was mentioned earlier on? Why don't we have a situation where Angus Robertson, instead of making a speech at Holyrood yesterday about all the things that went wrong and all the UK government phone calls that got cancelled, why is Angus Robertson not in the room? Why is he not part of the negotiating team on behalf of particular Scottish interests? I'd be very comfortable with that. Not just him, but people in Northern Ireland, people in Wales. Why don't we have a pan-UK negotiating team so that interests like the Scottish fishing industry that are particular to one part of the country don't get squeezed, and therefore you don't get this situation where a devolved government is able to come out and score another pretty big political victory on the back of something that the Westminster government has done. I'm afraid it's just another example of where the unionist parties just make life very difficult for themselves because of the setup.
Jeff, John Swinney posted on X, Scotland's fishing industry has been undermined by the UK government again. Like the Tories, Labour didn't even consult the Scottish government and treated our fishing communities as expendable. Only independents would give us the seat at the EU table to defend Scotland's interests. Do you want to talk to us about some of the language there that John Swinney's used?
Well, we know why you're asking this question, because I asked you, did you understand the reference to expendable, the word expendable? And you said, no, I didn't. Well, let me give you a little bit of history here. So I started working for Alex Salmond as an intern in 2004-05. And one of the first things I was asked to do by the office manager, great guy, Councillor Stephen Smith, is we were aware that this memo existed, and it was a memo at the time that was being prepared for the Heath government and actually for his office, as about the accession to the European Economic Community, the forebear to the EU at the time, to the common market essentially. And we knew under the 30-year rule that this document was going to be released, and in it said that in terms of the wider EU context, in terms of joining the European Union, or what it would become known as the European Union, the fishing industry could be regarded as quote-unquote expendable. Now, we had to look through a bunch of documents at the time to locate that. We located it quite quickly, actually. I remember Stephen Smith thought it would be like a week in London looking through the National Archives for it. We weren't. We actually found it in a few hours, amazingly. And by the time I flew back up to Aberdeen, there was a story from Sean Connery saying how disgraceful it was that he'd received this memo from Alex Salmond and that the Scottish fishing industry was being treated as expendable. And I thought, then I realised just how quickly and how strategic Alex Salmond worked. You needed to elevate something. Why don't you get James Bond to tell the story? So, look, the serious point is already made by Andy McKeever. The lack of contact, the lack of this dialogue with the Scottish government, it's an easy win, it's an easy hit. So the SNP are in the position they can say, well, we like bits of it and we understand the need to try and have greater relations with the EU, but once again, no consultation, not even treated with any degree of respect, given that fishing's largely devolved, and you've sold our fishermen down the river, and now communities up and down the coast will be very, very alarmed at this. And it's worth just pointing out from a regional perspective that Peterhead is the largest fish port in Europe. And we've had a conversation about energy profits levy just now and oil and gas job losses in the northeast. We have not had any advance on Acorn of any significance in terms of the carbon capture project. This region's taken a bit of a hit just now. And I don't want to repeat all the stuff I said last week, but it is pretty heartbreaking, alarming right now. And so I really do hope both governments are thinking long and hard about how they can support this region. It's not necessarily needing public money, as we keep saying. We don't need a British Steel nationalisation. We just need taxes, unfair taxes taken off. We just need a little bit of a punt, yes, some money towards Acorn, which is a nascent technology. But it does feel a little bit that we're getting hit over and over again right now. I have to say that. And I do feel for the fishermen and the industry that's been affected by this.
And that's the thing, because there's the big economic picture, which as we're kind of nudging at, fishing is seen as such a small part of. But actually, when you zoom in, the impact of these sorts of decisions on local communities is absolutely huge. Andy, do you want to come back in there?
Just in Shetland, I hope Andy was going to say something about Shetland as well. Shetland's a massive player in this regard as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just going to say. There's more fish landed in Shetland than in England, Wales and Northern Ireland combined.
Wow.
So there are pockets of real difficulty here as a result of deals with the EU over many years. But again, this is where I come back to the ability to just shoot themselves in the foot. Labour could, in a different world, have presented this as having been a good day for Scotland.
But it was welcomed by some. Is the other thing,
of course,
Andy.
it was.
So
Absolutely.
Even within fishing,
and you mentioned Salmon Scotland, because from an export point of view, from a point of view of getting food out to the EU, and France is one of the biggest destinations for Scottish salmon, which is a critically important industry in these I just talked about Shetland. Big salmon farming area as well. So this is good news for them on that hand. It's not all bad news. And I suppose this is the point of it, is that there's a little bit of one hand and a little bit of the other. But the difficulty is, from a PR point of view, it's all been the negative. in a country that voted pretty significantly to stay in the EU, this could in another world have been presented as having been a pretty good deal and a pretty good day. And if they had just integrated the Scottish Government a little bit more into what they were doing, and frankly given the Scottish Government a little bit less leeway to beat them over the head after the fact, then this could all have been presented relatively differently. And indeed, maybe the deal for our fishing communities might have been a little bit different in the grand scheme of things as well. I think it's unfortunately just another example of them just not going about things in a politically or economically particularly astute way.
Yeah, look, and you're right, actually, Callum. It's a good challenge because I am supportive of efforts to try and realign where we can around a greater relationship with the European Union. There's no doubt that this is a very early step. I mean, it's not transformational by any stretch, and I wouldn't be selling it as such if I was Labour, frankly, because there's not going to be a material difference anyway for the long term. There might be, but not in the short and medium term. So I do, let's be fair here. Let's play that. But I mean, I don't want to repeat Andy's points, but the politics of this have not been played particularly well, and you are left going, just how influential is Scottish Labour in all of this? And I think that has to be reflected on it if they're going to make any sort of fist of the next election in 2026. Final point on this though. Do not underestimate reform in some of these fishing communities. And, whether we agree with it or not, the point is that they kind of feel that they've been kind of shafted consecutively, some of the fishing communities. And I wouldn't be surprised if Nigel Farage makes a trip to the northeast pretty soon to make this very, very point. Would it be fair of him to do so, but perhaps not, and there would be questions around how he would have done it better in terms of his Brexit deal. We still don't know what the detail of that is, but he will see an opportunity in this. You mark my words, and he will make fishing part of that, particularly in Scotland when he visits here.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's go on, because Lynn gets in touch to ask about the by-election that's coming up, Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. And actually it builds on what we were just saying about Reform UK capitalising on these sorts of messages in Scotland. So Lynn says, I would welcome all of your thoughts on the amount of weight the SNP are putting behind this by-election, with all the big names and heavy hitters posting regularly on social media that they are out canvassing the doors to win a seat they currently hold. This will be Katie Loudon's third attempt to win a seat, having previously lost out in Rutherglen. So Lynn gets in touch on Saturday. She says, today it's reported that even MSP Nicola Sturgeon, brackets part-time in my opinion, will be taking time away from her book promotion tour and making an appearance. We've already seen campaign photos posted with the majority of the cabinet and other ministers. Is this desperation? If so, why? Asks Lynn. And I wonder, Jeff, will we start with you on this? Is it desperation? Is it the fact that this is a huge electoral talking point? It's potentially the only kind of electoral test that of this kind of scale that will happen before 2026 now. Maybe there'll be other by-elections between now and then. It's the only one we know of. And so it's about throwing the kitchen sink at it because it's going to dictate the story from here on out.
Yeah, look, let's give John Swinney and Kate Forbes a pass on the general election. I mean, they'd hardly got their feet under the table before the election was called. So I view this as a massive test. There's been better news for the SNP and local by-elections of late, but this is a parliamentary seat at a time we're about to enter a parliamentary election in Scotland. So, of course, the SNP are throwing everything at it. I think every party will be throwing everything at it because it will be viewed as a bit of a barometer to what might transpire in, 13, 14 months or so. So, look, less than that, 12 months. Yeah. Oh, my goodness, 12 months.
10 months, really.
Yes, indeed. So, yeah, look, I can see why you'd throw the kitchen sink. Of course you would, politically. Now, I've got a bit of intelligence just from speaking to some people who've been out campaigning in different parties. One in the SNP, one in the Labour, and one in the Tories. They all say the same thing, that folk are scunnered, they're fed up, and I think turnout's going to be low. And if turnout is low on the day, look for reform. And I don't think, amazing as it is to say it, that second place is a ridiculous notion. I would still put perhaps Labour as favourites for second place. Can you believe we're even saying that a year after they've won a landslide election at Westminster? But look out for reform here, and what a seismic shock that would be if they managed to sneak into second place. But last thing I just very quickly say is, it doesn't almost matter how reform do. We know they're going to do reasonably well because they've come coming from such a low base. And so that will be a big story emanating from the evening anyway, I'm sure. But if they do get second place, bloody hell. I mean, that's a big story.
There's a couple of people I've spoken to as well who have both independently said the same thing, that on weekend days when obviously the campaigners are out in force and there's stalls up on the high streets and whatever, that people are gathering around the Reform UK sort of area and having a big chat and a nice friendly time, and down the road is the Scottish Labour one, which is not seeing much activity at all. Now, I'm happy to hear from campaigners from all sides on your own take on the inside, the inside track and what's going on. One of those people definitely has a stake in this thing. One of the people who told me that absolutely does not. They are looking at it completely objectively and saying there is enthusiasm for Reform UK. Andy, what are you making of the by-election? And Lynn's thoughts here is they're throwing a lot at it. They've got Nicola Sturgeon out on the campaign trail. I'd put alongside that reports from Paul Hutchin, who says, I understand Scottish Labour have still not agreed to put their Hamilton candidate David Russell up for an STV candidates debate on June the 2nd. Party insiders fear Russell will do badly on TV, as in David Russell. An extraordinary situation. The debate could now be Reform versus SNP with no Labour, says the Daily Record political editor.
Yeah, well, let's see. I think there are two interesting things in particular about this by-election. The first one is that the SNP are now at the fag end of their 4th term of office.
Astonishing.
And the record in government, if an impartial person would say that the record in government is patchy. Let's call it patchy. I think that's a reasonable word to use.
Not the first two governments, I didn't think. I thought they were very, very good.
They were a solid couple of years.
Anywhere else in the democratic world, a government with a patchy record at the end of its 4th term would not win a by-election. I mean, they wouldn't even, it would be ridiculous to even think they could possibly win a by-election, right? So I think that is notable in itself. People from abroad would look at this and say, that's odd. What's going on in that country? I think the second interesting thing, though, is obviously to do with reform. I mean, it'll be I still think there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge when it comes to reform and their performance in May 2026. There's a long way to go. With a party like Reform, which has grown so quickly, there's a lot that can go wrong, principally to do with the sort of people that are attaching themselves to it. And I don't think we know enough yet to know where that's going to end up in 12 months' time. They could do well, they could get 15, 16 seats, they also could get 4. Right? I think there's a long way to go in that yet. But what is interesting will, I think, be the shift in voting patterns between the Tories and Labour and which of them goes to Reform. Because as far as I can see at the moment, the Keir, Starmer and Kevin Badenoch strategy is basically the same, which is Nigel Farage is bang on right, so don't vote for him.
Very good.
Expand on that a bit more for us.
That's what they're saying. They're saying, oh yes, of course he's right about immigration, so that's why we're moving and we're doing this and this and this. And of course, what they're expecting.
The critical point, they're not explicitly saying he's right. They're just dealing with the issues as they said. So he's dictating discourse in this country.
And the window on all the debates that Nigel Farage wants to lead, the window is moving towards Farage in all these debates. Okay?
Yeah.
And they're expecting that the population will say, they're going to do it this time. I know they've said they've been going to do it for the last 25 years and they haven't. But they're going to do it this time, so actually I was going to vote for Farage, but I think I'm just going to go back and vote for them now because they said they've made a mistake and now they know. I mean, come on. This is not the world. So I think that sort of pattern will be interesting, actually, to see just how many votes shift from the Tories and Labour over to Reform and just how well they do. So, I mean, you know my views on by-elections, guys, right? My views on by-elections.
There's been some flip-flopping, I think.
I think they're interesting in the moment, but I think they often don't have a bearing on the big election that follows. And I think this will be the same, but that's not to say it won't reveal some really interesting movements and patterns when we see it in a couple of weeks' time.
Okay, I'll be nice and I'll be a bit nasty. Right, you're right in terms of, Farage dictating kind of discourse just now in terms of the response, the knee-jerk response from Badenoch and Starmer. And you're also right, actually, to be fair, to say, look, we still need to see the bones of what this Reform Party looks like in a Scottish context. We don't know, but you play the ball where it lies. They're in the aftermath of such a massive victory. There's a bit of a glow about them. They don't have a record to defend, and so I do anticipate them doing reasonably well in the by-election. But the reason that this is important is for the reason you've just set out, Andy, is because if they do well and get to second place or close to it, that dictates how Anna Sarwar and Russell Finlay have to respond, because and so the same thing that's happening in England will happen in Scotland as far as those parties are concerned. Now, the one outlier is how the SNP respond. And I would just have a word of caution for John Swinney in this. He seems to be wanting to raise the prospects of reform by calling them out, just not inviting them to my big summit on how we can all be nice to each other and all the rest of it. By doing that, he does run the risk of raising the prospect of greater success for reform as well. There is a balance to be struck there. You've got to be careful. Look at that local by-election result in Clydebank. If I'm not mistaken, I was just trying to look it up on my phone, but I couldn't find it in time. I think they were only 6-7% behind the SNP reform. Yeah. I mean, that's starting to get squeaky bum time, to quote the world's greatest manager, Alex Ferguson. I mean, look, that is, you're getting into, okay, we've had our fun with them, they're splitting the unionist vote, but let's make sure they don't overtake us as well. And so there has to be a little bit more thought given to how the SNP approach this as well, not just Labour and Tories.
That's an interesting thing. I don't know what you think about this then, Jeff, because I think there's a real juxtaposition here between ideas. Because on the one hand, Swinney must be thinking, the better Farage does, the better the prospects of him being Prime Minister. Does independence get a better enemy than that? Or a bigger friend than that, sorry, I should say, from the independence point of view. Do we get a better chance to really accelerate the case for independence than Nigel Farage being in a position of power? So I get that. But on the other hand, now he hasn't done this too much just yet, but he has been in danger. I think Swinney has flirted with suggesting that people who vote for reform are wrong-uns. And I do think that he has to be very careful with that. Because what you do not want to do in your own country is call a relatively large subsection of the population wrong-uns because of who they're voting for. So there is that. It's a real double-edged sword, I think, for him in that respect. I think you're right. What if they do get 25% or whatever in this by-election? You then I think people are then compelled to ask John, well, what do you think of those? Not what do you think of Nigel Farage? What do you think of the 25%
people that voted? Yeah,
voted
absolutely. That's your own folk. That's exactly.
So
that's the risk.
Risky.
That is the risk. Yeah, that is the risk.
Yeah.
That's why I think this by-election is utterly fascinating, and the timing of it. It's just so relevant to what might come afterwards. Having it a year out from the Holyrood elections is so insightful.
Just on timing as well, so I'm just thinking of the issues that have absolutely plagued Labour since they came to power. And perhaps foremost among them is winter fuel payment allowance. And this was a huge part of the English local election drubbing that they got. And yet there's kind of floating in the air, we've been talking about it on the radio a bit, floating in the air is this idea that winter fuel payment, there may be a U-turn on the way, but it's nothing concrete yet on that.
Yeah, look, great point. I couldn't believe it yesterday. I was looking at a story in the BBC, and it said that options are under discussion to changing eligibility. Essentially, ministers at the UK level are considering easing the winter fuel payment cuts. But according to this news item, that decision could be announced on the 11th of June. Now, what bloody use is that to Scottish Labour? Because the election is on the 5th of June. So the SNP, who have been campaigning on this already, saying they took it away, we reinstored it, easy, simple messaging. I think Paul Hutchin, actually, who you mentioned earlier, pointed that out on social media. He's absolutely right to do so. And yet the Labour Party can't campaign on the fact that they listened and they tried to ease it, because by that point, the decision won't have been taken. This is where we get to the lack of dialogue and strategy between UK and Scottish Labour parties. And they need to get their act together, because if they could absolve that now, then, they'd have a much better run into the election. Something to get, stick your teeth into, hook on, but they're not. And the SNP can dine out on that until election day, knowing that the decision won't be made until a week later. Just nonsensical, in my opinion. Really poor strategy.
It's also fascinating because I personally was quite taken by Shanks last week saying that the relationship between himself and the Scottish Government was pretty decent. He's not going a week without speaking to Kate Forbes or Gillian Martin. That's all well and good. We like that. That's good. Constructive working together. It seems the relationship between UK Labour and Scottish Labour is actually not in as good shape as the relationship between UK Labour and the SNP.
Yeah, look, I think, just very quickly on that, I think on energy, Michael makes a fair point, and I've heard the same from the Scottish Government as well. I think there has been a lot better working, and that is to be welcomed. I really genuinely do welcome that. But we just talked earlier on about the lack of consultation on the fishing stuff, and now we seem to have lack of consultation within themselves on the winter fuel allowance. So it's not all good. There's not greater alignment across the piece. There is on energy, which is to be welcome, but this stuff is elementary, and when I was an advisor, this sort of stuff you just dine out on. You really would, when you saw this in your opposition.
Of course you would. Right, we are nearly at the end of the podcast. We've just got one more thing, because Elaine has been in the email inbox in the last few days talking about Flamingo Land. So I just want a thought from each of you on this. Elaine gets in touch to say, you'll no doubt be aware of the appalling decision by an unelected government reporter to allow a planning application by Flamingo Land to build a monstrous resort in Balloch, despite 174,000 objections and a unanimous rejection by the National Park. She includes her email to Ivan McKee in the email to us. Apparently he's the only person who can deal with this. Locals are outraged. What are your thoughts? Asks Elaine. Just as a sidebar, she says, I spotted Andy in the Parliament Cafe last Thursday. That sounds like McKeever, just chilling, having a coffee. She says, we had tickets for First Minister's questions, but our ScotRail train broke down, so we were too late. So we had lunch in the cafe instead. Andy looked as if he was working very hard, proving the age-old adage, looks can be deceiving. So Elaine says, we didn't want to disturb him to say hello and tell him how much we love your podcast. Well, thank you, Elaine. Andy, go on.
Elaine should have come over and said hello. I imagine it was fruit scone and black Americano time.
Is that a bit of a tradition in the cafe?
But we'll say. I tell you what, good fruit scone in the Parliament
You're
cafe.
such a Morningside lovey, aren't you? You're so... Just drips out of you. It makes me feel sick.
It's a good fruit scone. Well,
Will
of course,
you be enjoying a fruit scone at Flamingo Land?
I am. You're right, Jeff. I am a Central Belter, which is why I know that we're talking about Balloch.
I said Morningside, my friend.
As the Highlanders.
Callum's been in it.
Honestly,
This is almost bad as Dogood, David Dogood from you, Andy.
Balloch is just outside Inverness, for the record. So I just assumed that everybody would be sensible and follow the way that you do it in the Highlands.
I'm not taking any Dogood lessons, as my bestie from university will attest to, who is a ducat, and he's a listener, so he's going to be upset with you again, Jeffrey.
Flamingo Land. Come on, let's out.
Right,
time is against us, and Elaine has an important issue.
So I, on the fundamental issue of whether or not Flamingo Land should have gone ahead, I don't actually agree with Elaine, as it happens, as much as I welcome her listenership. I think we are generally too sceptical and antipathetic towards this sort of development in Scotland. I think it's a good thing, and so generally speaking, I'm happy enough with that. There may be some question marks over the process. I don't think we could. I mean, the Scottish planning process is incredibly slow, so I'm not sure we could say it hasn't had the required scrutiny, but people can have their views as to whether or not that is the case. I've got different worries, frankly, about Flamingo Land, and it's not about Flamingo Land itself, it's about where it is. Because we have a shocking trunk road network in this country. very embarrassing, actually, internationally, our trunk road network. And Balloch is bang on the A82, one of our worst roads. A massive haulage route. So haulage in Scotland generally goes up the A90 up to Aberdeen, which is not too bad a road in the grand scheme of things, along the A96, which is a shocking road, obviously, and either down the A9 or down the A82. So it's a massive haulage route. It's really important for renewables. The Corriglass pump storage hydro site, massive pump storage hydro site, needs the A82, and now more pressure on the A82 here as well. So if I had to raise one concern about this development, it wouldn't be about Flamingo Land itself. It would be about the road infrastructure, which I'm not at all convinced can cope with it.
Jeff?
I'm really sorry, Elaine. This one's passed me by. It genuinely has. I didn't know anything about it until you mentioned it yesterday. So I'm totally unaware of it, except to say that I did go to Flamingo Land in second year activities week in Scarborough, near Scarborough, and that was good fun. I'm not saying I'm not coming down on this either way, but hugely controversial from the Google search that I did this morning, and I think my understanding is it's planning application in principle that has been awarded. So there is still another step in this to go through with the council. No doubt there will be lots of representations made, at which point I believe that the Scottish Government may or may not choose to call it in. So there is still other routes of recourse for campaigners such as Elaine, but I don't like talking about things I don't really know about. So I'll just say that Flamingo Land was good when we went on our Scarborough visit when I was 11 years old, 12 years old.
Can I just come in with one more point? It's nothing to do with Scarborough. I don't think I've been to Scarborough, if I'm being honest, but we never know. There's another important thing here, and again, it's nothing to do with the planning application, but the foremost and very vocal and vociferous opponent of this is Ross Greer from
the Scottish Greens. Yeah.
Now, there's a leadership election coming up in the Green Party. It's heavily rumoured that Ross Greer and Gillian Martin there, what a Freudian slip that would be. And Gillian Mackay may end up being the ticket that runs the Scottish Green Party. And there is a feeling in the SNP that if it was to be Ross Greer who was in charge, he's a more pragmatic Green figure that they feel they could potentially work with if they need a little bit of help after 2026. I think this is probably a big enough issue for Ross Greer that it would actually pose a material problem to any discussions that took place between his Green Party and the Scottish Government after 2026. So I just drop that in there as an interesting point for us to think about in a year's time.
And a good point on which to conclude the podcast. Elaine, keep in touch on that. It seems like you're passionate about it, and we welcome that. So we'd love to hear more from you as this goes along. I think the Scottish Government, at the time of speaking, have said they're not going to call it in, but there is process still to happen. Do keep in touch, Elaine, and you can all keep in touch indeed. You can WhatsApp us 0333 404 6507 with all of your thoughts and voice notes, comments, questions and critiques. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.